Security scan. Please stand by. Scanning. Do not move. Security scan successful. You now have full access to all files. Welcome to Conspiracies, Inc. With your host, Brian Datillo. Do you believe?
I am Brian Datillo. This is Conspiracies, Inc. Thank you for joining us for our very first season as we tackle the alien cover-up, the alien controversy, the alien conspiracy, and a quick wrap-up. Why am I doing a show like this? Why am I doing a podcast so crazy? Because I grew up with a mom who worked for the National Enquirer, and every house we were in was haunted, and there was a cast of characters that we would meet, psychics and past life regressionists, and a lot of things that would happen growing up that I was curious about. Among them were some alien activity, and so much so that I dedicated the first 2 episodes of this podcast to being put under hypnosis by Yvonne Smith, the leading hypnotherapist in the nation, if not the world, influenced by Benjamin Simon. And she definitely put me under. So if you missed those 2 episodes, please check them out. Today, however, I am joined by UCLA professor David Shorter, who we all know and love, very good friend of mine. He teaches a class at UCLA called Ghosts, Aliens, and Psychics. Psychics or psychic?
Psychics, alien psychics, and ghosts.
Alien, psychics, and ghosts. David, thank you for joining us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Yes. This is our second time around the track, but we're going to get it right. I won't be so technically challenged this time, I promise. Okay.
No, let's do it.
Okay, so real quick, right off the bat, I just wanted to ask you, with all the stuff that is coming out lately in the government with Roswell and with Area 51, and in the past year, they said that they told us everything. They said that they showed us all the files they had to show us. But then they started this UFO task force. Is there anything you can tell us that you know about why the UFO task force was developed, what they might do? Is this another way of distracting us from past maybe lack of secrecy on their part, or lack of honesty, or lack of closure? Do you think that that has anything to do with what's going on now with the UFO task force?
I don't actually think that they're looking backwards with the task force. The task force was created after a few months of wrangling for funding, and it was based on the June preliminary assessment from the director of the National Intelligence. And when the June report came out from the National Intelligence, that stated that they had 21 cases of unidentifiable, and I think they really do mean that. They have no idea where it could be from, of aerial phenomena. That's particularly in missile sites, and the assessment says that we're particularly concerned with missile sites and areas of government research. And it's essentially in enabling the Department of Defense to prepare for action based on a study, and this is funding the study. So the task force is going to, you might want to say, turn what is the historical study, Project Blue Book, into an active. You might want to say it's a reenactment, a realigning of that Blue Book stage. And the way that they framed it when the task force was announced was that this was to protect the pilots, the planes, the passengers that might be in our airspace, which is a bit, you might want to say, ridiculous, because if someone's visited us from a different galaxy or a different dimension, clearly their technology would not have it so that they're running into our little Cessna planes over our airport. So there was a little bit, when you read these government reports, there's a little bit, okay, I can see why you're saying this, but it's clearly to cover up for something else. I think it's a pretty positive sign, as opposed to something like Space Force, which I think is somewhat ridiculous. The task force on actual UFO or unidentified aerial phenomena is actually kind of, in my opinion, a bit positive, because it's a baby step towards some of the disclosure that we see in other countries or nation states. So I think it's a good thing. I think a little of how it's framing itself is that it's for our own good, but it's absolutely not. It's for national security, I'm sure.
Okay, but the Space Force you think is somewhat ridiculous in regards to preparing us for maybe a intergalactic Federation type setup, maybe preparing.
Yeah, I guess in some ways I don't have a very high regard for us waging any sort of defense and or aggressive battle with extraterrestrial technologically advanced, and that's an assumption that they'd be
Right.
technologically advanced. I just published an article 2 weeks ago in a peer-reviewed journal that's all about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and how our assumption that they're going to be technologically advanced is really problematic, because no society is advanced in one thing versus other things, or it doesn't make it an advanced society just because it has great technology. They could have great technology and not even know how to keep a 4/4 rhythm. You don't know what makes something advanced. But you have to assume that if they're either transferring dimensions or going through galaxies, that they're not going to be much of a competition, that the US government's not going to be much of a competition defense-wise. So the US Space Force, I think, was a bit of a, like almost everything else that I imagine from the Trump era, which is regardless of whether it's politically wise or not, I bet there's an economic reason to it that's
Right.
almost always undergirding it.
Okay. Okay. Moving on, I guess, what can you tell us regarding your class at UCLA? What are some of the concepts that you guys go over there? Is there anything you could tell us about, I don't know, anything that you're covering lately that's a bit different than you have because of what's going on lately?
Yeah.
Because you are one of the very few professors to tackle this subject on a college level. So, I mean, that in itself, I think, is amazing and worth mentioning and honorable. And I think there's got to be more of you. But what is it about your class that you think makes it interesting to take?
Okay, well, yeah, I want to say first of all that I do think I'm one of the few. Jeffrey Kripal, Susan Lepselder, these other faculty in the U.S. We are few and far between, and I think a lot of that has to do with the way that the stigma of actually giving any credence to any abductee or any contact is a continuing issue. I mean, you literally look at the report from June from the National Intelligence Agency, and it literally says one of the reasons why we have so little data from airline pilots is the stigma associated with having any sort of sighting of the first, they don't use this, but I'll go in and add it, first, second, third, or fourth kind. Once you have those sort of encounters, or once you start engaging those sort of voices, it really changes. And I went to abductee meetings in Phoenix, Arizona from like 1998 to 1999, when there was a period in my life when I thought I was abducted. I don't think that necessarily now, but going to those meetings, when you sit with people who've been abducted, it's very hard to leave those and think, oh, that's all bullshit or that's all nonsense. In fact, you come away a bit thinking, I need to enlarge the way that I think about what's possible in the world. And I think that's where my class, to answer your question, is different from someone like Jeffrey Kripal, who's putting UFOs and alien contact within a religious studies framework, or Susan Lepselder, who's doing it within a folklore. I'm sort of doing mine in a history of science, which is that almost everything that we study when we call aliens and psychics and ghosts has had its moment to be understood under different contexts. It's either government conspiracy or abductees shed light on where we are as a sort of psychological practice, particularly regarding hypnosis.
Right.
There's all these sort of race, class, and gender readings you can give to UFOs and aliens. But for me, I go through each one of these as a professor as a means to ask a larger question of how, instead of it being paranormal, it's actually perinormal, which is it's just before it becomes normal, it seems wrong. Remember, the world was flat, Earth was flat, right?
Right.
There's these things called scientific revolutions that Thomas Kuhn, an amazing philosopher, wrote about. And he says, he's not talking about little things like we've developed a new alloy. He's talking about meta paradigms, like what we think life is. Is it always carbon based? What do we think, even when we look at ETs, whether they're designed by a CG graphics specialist in Hollywood or a person who's been abducted. And I'm going back to abduction stories, all the way to like the 40s. When you look at the range of abduction stories that are put on TV, they are almost always with 4 limbs, some sort of face with an eye. There's absolutely no guarantee that an interdimensional or intergalactic being would have those evolutionarily designed anatomical features. So I use it as like, well, how do we have to actually change the way we think and broaden what counts as science? Like the scientific method is driven incredibly by materiality or object orientated science, as I call it. Almost all three, aliens, psychics, and ghosts, require us to think outside of object orientated science. But if your entire scientific history has been based on the, you might want to call the scientific method, and it needs repeatability, and it needs physicality, and it needs to be in some ways duplicated, and what we're talking about are esoteric and anomalies, then you're not going to get those things, which means the tools that we've used in science aren't great at alien, psychics, and ghosts.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you say that you thought you were abducted, because I know, which leads me to kind of my next question. You aren't a believer in hypnosis. You know I was put under. I thought I was abducted. You thought you were abducted to the point you started going into these meetings. And it's...
We've never talked about it. I've never told anyone, and I almost just caught myself just now. I can't believe, there must be something about my confidence level lately that has made me say that to you, because I actually don't think I ever told you that I used to go to anonymous meetings. I think we're not actually supposed to talk too much about them, trying to keep the AA sort of protocol.
Got it.
But I have to correct something you just said. I do not necessarily think hypnosis is inappropriate, problematic, or necessarily, you might want to say, across the board wrong.
Right.
I just simply, like in my class, I teach this this entire journal. It's called Psychological Inquiry, and it's a peer-reviewed journal that's used inside psychological sciences. In 1996, they did an entire issue. So we're talking 12 or 14 articles written by scholars, practicing psychologists, all on the issue of hypnosis and abductees. So, I mean, it's literally like 12 different perspectives. And so you're getting people talking about how hypnosis has been used in court trials. We put people away based on testimony, and yet we don't give testimony validity when it has to do with abductees.
Right.
And when I line that journal up with the long history of abduction claims that were collected both by Thomas Bullard at my previous university, Indiana University, or that I gained knowledge of through Whitney Strieber and our relationship, what I was able to see were that you have these criticisms of hypnosis. To me, they still do not override or overrule the thousands and thousands and thousands of abduction claims that are sharing similar aspects across cultures, languages, and nations, particularly from areas that do not have the same popular cultural influences to have given them those visions or ideas.
Right.
And I still think, though, that there's still some, you have to, as a critical thinker, think, well, what do we know about hypnosis? And my personal belief, based on reading that, is that you are opening a door, and any door that's open, things can go in as much as they can go out.
Oh, yeah.
And I studied, when I say I teach about mediums, I mean, in my classes, we literally watched John Edward and Rosemary Altea, videos of them, watching them working, watching where the cameras are at, watching whether there's earbud. Like, we're really being critical. Well, I've done the same thing to John Mack interviews with his abductees. All respect to John Mack and the way that he was a trailblazer, I can't help but see in those actual recordings the way that certain questions were leading about, like there was no mention of someone else being in the room. And then he would literally say, now describe the figure coming up to you. Listen, you just told this person to create a figure in the room. That sort of stuff. You can still have those sorts of criticisms that hypnosis might introduce.
Power of suggestion.
Power suggestion is very powerful during a hypnotic state.
Okay.
And so because I actually think the hypnotic state is valid is my criticism. But because I just said it's valid, it means it works both ways. It's also valid in helping people parse a bit of their own personal history. And I'll say something else I've never said in any kind of YouTube interview or interview, but as a person who was sexually abused as a child, I can tell you for 100% as a fact, I did not remember aspects of it until I was 21.
Wow.
Then I didn't even remember more until I was 26. And then I remembered more when I was 30. The brain gives you what you can handle at certain times.
I believe
and I think hypnosis is great because it could perhaps help you do some of that memory work. I also think the brain's going to do it naturally on its own accord, and that hypnosis could be a bit premature
Uh-huh.
for some people who might not be ready to handle all of the psycho-emotional and social issues that come around with being an abductee or an abusee of any sort. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
And that's something I kind of battled with after I was put under. So yeah, I totally get that.
I've seen enough videos of abductees say, I think I was abducted. Yeah, and there's all these really, weird visions, and I'm kind of afraid of little kids, and sometimes I feel I'm telepathic. And then they say inside their actual, history of their life. And so I decided to go get hypnotized by John Mack, or I was one of the Mackeys, and I went to Cambridge, or John Mack came down to Florida, and we went to hypnosis. And then you almost see a personality breakdown and a divorce and a loss of actual standing in their social situation because of the information that was released during that hypnotic session.
Right.
That to me is not saying that hypnosis is bad and wrong and it's not working, just the opposite. It's working. It's working in ways that we want to be careful of, but also just in a compassionate sense. You as a person who is doing a podcast or interviews with people, I would say hypnosis is something you want to actually couch in very, very careful terms, that you make sure that you're ready for what might be discovered or input during that process.
That's really good advice, because it's also, post-traumatic in itself, just the realizations you find out.
Exactly.
But you also have one of the most amazing opinions and outlooks on the whole alien identity itself, and even going back to Roswell with your family history and all the stuff that you discovered through your father. Will you share with us some of the things you found out that leads you to believe your personal, and well, not personal, I'm sure many people feel that, you don't have an everyday cookie cutter outlook on who aliens are, how they are, and where they're from. I know that you feel that or have a lot of information based on genetic mutation and stuff like that during the first two world wars. Will you share with us some of the things that you found out through your father and some of the things that shape your opinion about that I think is amazing?
Thank you. I admit that a lot of professors say that they were brought to their subject of study through some sort of, personal interest. And mine started, I think when I was 8 or 9 is when I really came to understand that my father wasn't just a secret person. He literally worked at top secret government clearance level. And so that meant, as a 9-year-old, my father sometimes had briefcases on his hand, on his one hand, and another briefcase on the other. And one briefcase went inside a safe when he got home, and then the doors were locked. I was never allowed into his office inside our house when I was a kid because he didn't want me to ever accidentally see something that he was working on.
Wow.
I think that it's really perhaps telling of my own psychological, the way that I grew up, but you would think I would be a very much believer in government conspiracy, but there were vans generally parked outside our houses. My father and I both like fast cars and race cars a bit. And when I look back at it, I realized those were enabling him to get away so that no one could actually track us or follow him on. So his weekends were racing race cars up in the mountains because a van couldn't follow you. And also you're in the mountains. And back then there were no cell phones, but he knew that he couldn't be sort of seen by planes he literally lived that kind of life where something really made him feel scared.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to jump to the end. He's died of prostate cancer a few years ago. And before he died, when he knew he was dying, he enabled me to record him and ask him questions. So I have hours of tape now that are digitized, and I'm working through them for various projects, media projects. So because of that, and you would understand this, I can't tell you, the 12 things that I know, because we got to watch out in terms of what it means for someone who's passed away, who had top secret clearance, to now come forward with those things, puts me in danger and perhaps his wife.
I totally understand. Yeah.
So that being said, I can say some things, which is that my father was responsible for being brought things, and he was told to reverse engineer them. And his job was to determine whether the materials that were brought to him were terrestrial or possibly extraterrestrial. That's quite a sort of preface to say what your job is working on. And we might note that he's working in central South New Mexico, an hour and a half from Roswell on the White Sands Missile Range.
Okay.
So here we have a guy who's working for a government contract group, and this is a really key component when we talk about anything having to do with UFOs. The U.S. government doesn't have to get its hands dirty at all. It simply has contract groups that it works for. JPL. People know that people work in the defense industry for military reasons. So I have no doubt that some of his work was going to make new products that might perhaps. And as a college person, when I had my sort of rebellious moment, like, Dad, you helped the defense industry, but. There was a point when I was 10 or 9, I walked into his office because the door was open and he had schematics on a drafting board. And I looked at them and I said, "Oh, I didn't know you were doing the Batmobile." And he jumped up and grabbed me and pushed me out of the room. Now, it was not until 5 years later that the stealth bomber came to people, and that was my dad's work. And he had learned how to fuse 2 types of metals together without using a seam or bolts.
Wow.
Based on something that they had found in the desert of New Mexico that enabled them to duplicate that technology.
Okay.
So you put all those pieces together, and the quickest way to say it is that my father seemed to be doing reverse engineering for a government contract group in New Mexico tasked with better understanding debris from crash sites. Now, from there, one could go in a lot of directions. So I will tell you, in the interest of time, I don't think all of those were extraterrestrial crash sites. And I do think, now that I've done a lot more research on the matter, that what was taking place in New Mexico at that time is probably so disparaging of something that we would want U.S. scientists or U.S. government to be involved with, that I do not think there's going to go back to a previous question. I do think there's going to be a moment when the U.S. government or any federal agency comes clean about Roswell. They would much rather you keep thinking Roswell is both real and false, because as long as you keep stuck in that binary between Roswell either being true or false, you won't ask any other questions. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It does. But
you use the words that, I forget how smart you are sometimes. You know the history so well and you know all the theories that you kind of gave away what that would be, which is that there's clearly genetic biological research taking place in this time. And that's been a theory that you and I didn't come up with. There's an author who wrote a whole book about it. I have right here, Nick Redfern. People can go do their own research. My father in those interviews sheds a lot of light on that. My father did not say the government is managing a genetic hybrid DNA fusion sort of process with human aliens coming together. However, he did say, without a doubt, there are buildings, multiple stories. They go underground. You wouldn't even know they existed when you looked at the desert in front of you. And there are people who work and live there, and they never leave there. And what they do there is such high-level engineering and theoretical physics that he strongly believed, and I would say he actually had evidence for, I can say that now, that the people who were working there were, maybe you might want to say, on the spectrum in terms of their intelligence and their ability. And you could imagine in that context not having a lot of great social adequacy or norms with culture. So when he interacted with them, he left those encounters saying to himself, I'm not sure who I was just talking to was a 100% human. So that's a bit like mind-blowing and a bit really
it is
out there to say that.
It's incredible.
I didn't say what you could say. I just said it leads you right up to that point to be able to say something else. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it's for people who say, the distance in light years is too great for these alien races to come here. So your explanation really fits that if it's a government. So what you're saying is that the bodies that have been recovered through Roswell, they're genetically designed by the US government. They're not necessarily ETs from a different planet dimensionally traveling. Not that you don't think that that's possible, but the fact that you brought that to my attention, even a couple years ago, I was so sure that it was an alien based outside of our normal solar system realm. But for it to be right under our nose in these deep underground military bases and have, I've done my research on that too. And yes, I know that we're aligned all through that area with military bases, and they are hiding something, and the levels as you go down get deeper and deeper to the floors you have access to. And it makes sense to me that the biggest shame of it would be the government behind it and kind of allowing us to feel that it's maybe alien, maybe not, because it even hides their secret more.
Yes. I think everything you said is true in a you might want to say a hypothetical tone. I would add to it that, and this is really crazy, and I don't think I've said this publicly, my father ended up marrying another woman after my mom, and his second wife's, her mother was the triage nurse in Socorro, New Mexico, when they brought 2 bodies in one night.
Okay, so when the bodies were taken from the crash site and they were taken to White Sands.
Yeah.
White Sands.
Hold on. So this is not the Roswell site. This is a Socorro crash.
Right. Different crash.
Different crash. Sheriff says, there's this people saying a fire or a little fire. There's been some sort of explosion. My stepmom, I'm not super close with her, but my dad's wife's mother, only spoke Spanish, was the triage nurse in the hospital that night. And I have him on recording telling this story. She's there and they wheel in 2 bodies, and these bodies are without a doubt. I mean, I asked her, I went home from college one time when I found about this, because at the time I'm living with a tribe off and on in Mexico, being like an anthropology sort of guy. So I'm good at recording and I want to get stories down when I hear stories. So I go back to New Mexico to record this story, and there she is crying, running a rosary through her hand, and in Spanish saying, and these little bodies with very little tiny ears and really flat noses and really big heads, and no body hair, and they were gasping, and there were the gashes in their stomach, and there was this greenish white ooze coming out of it, and we were calling the doctor, and we didn't know what to do, and she's like literally like kind of praying a rosary in between the lines of her story because she's so disturbed. And I'm talking to her when she's in her 90s, and then she says, and this military truck pulls up, screeches out the door. They bust in the door. 2 big men open a big black bag and just slam the bodies into the bag, zip it up, and throw it on the truck. And she's crying, not only because this is a disturbing worldview for a Mexican Catholic woman in New Mexico.
Right.
She was crying because those were living bodies. And they just slammed them into a bag, threw them in the back of a truck, and took off. An open air truck. I don't mean like an SUV, like a military trailer.
Right.
And she was so disturbed. So, it wasn't just that my father worked on top secret levels, or that I am somehow interested in the history of sciences and how to rethink what we thought was normal in the world. It's also that I come from the borderlands, and the borderlands, I mean, for anyone who ever grew up in super rural areas, but particularly West Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, rural Colorado, Oregon these days, there are places in which things happen that even as a kid, you're just like, oh yeah, that's just a weird, huge football-sized air thing. And what do? You say, I guess it's the military up to something we don't know about. You just literally always say that because there's always some military base around. And what the military likes to do is keep some dangling keys so that you're constantly watching them. And Roswell, in my opinion, is one of them, as is Area 51.
What do you say to people who are skeptic of the paranormal itself, who just have a closed eye to it and say that we're all crazy and that maybe what you teach on a college level isn't worthy of a college class, which I don't agree with. I think that's incredibly ignorant. But what would you say to those people who would think that? Because it's hard for some people to grasp and accept what we're saying is truth a lot, because it's hard for them to even hear it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would in a compassionate tone say I completely understand why that would be the case, because your entire education from whenever you were born until now has proceeded along a certain set of you might want to say assumptions about the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as a social scientist, put my weight behind science. And I'm not really one to jump to government conspiracies or criticisms of experts who have spent their life working and training to do something. And I have a lot of passion for teaching and I have a lot of care for teachers. But in 1980, if you're taking a biology class, you're getting a certain ideology. I mean, I was in biology, which is a hard science, in high school, and I was, told that HIV is for sick individuals who have a mental problem, right? I mean, that's what thinking is at a certain time, and yet it's being given under the form of science. Well, I love science, but I also want science to change, and those things you think are absolutely not real in the world. We have to keep in mind you're coming from a whole era, we're talking hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And we're coming from a particular culture in which we are reliant upon particular tools and methods to understand phenomena. And those tools and methods are only going to produce results on what they can make sense of and measure. And you're not going to be able to quickly measure psi ability or chi energy. So let's look at it in the form of healing. I love x-rays. I absolutely love an antibiotic when I need one. Mm-hmm. And I go to an allopathic doctor. That being said, the way that the pharmaceutical company and the insurance companies are working very much to control the way that I can actually get medical care mm-hmm. does not make me go all in on allopathic medicine when the understanding of the body as immaterial, chis, channels, energies, that goes back 6,000 years.
Right.
So acupuncture has helped more people in the history of the world than x-rays. I'm not saying one is right or wrong. We need to bring them together. And that's my view of the paranormal. Let's put more on the table rather than pushing things off the table and say that's not understandable. I actually think the university needs to have more classes on these issues because I can tell you from firsthand experience, the things we talk about there are so far reaching. Biology students love the class. Astrophysicists love my class. Art students love my class. Because we're sort of saying we need to put more on the table to consider what is this world that we could possibly live instead of this narrow. I don't want to live in a world that's so narrow that it just rules out anything immaterial or anything that it considers spooky. I mean, I've been interviewing mediums and psychics for, I think, 15 years. I've interviewed people who go to them. I've recorded their conversations. I've obviously had my own readings because they'll sit there and say, hey, let me tell you something. And I guess I would end this very long answer by saying, I've had things told to me by mediums that blew me away.
Right.
Not because of something they said about right then, but something they said would happen the next day at 3 p.m. or 4 months later, things that were not on my radar, not subconsciously, not consciously, not on any internet. I mean, I create fake names. I wear wedding rings when I'm not married. I do crazy stuff for these interviews.
Right.
And yet I've been shown things that are completely not understandable according to previous notions of the mind. Now, maybe when someone says to me, I just don't believe that stuff, I think it's all fake, I think to myself, maybe it's not for you.
Right.
Like maybe you're supposed to.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a great life not thinking about it.
Right.
That's not the path I have, though. And that's not your path, obviously.
Right. Great answer. Okay, and last, do you think, on the medical note, do you think that vaccines or the pandemic play into any type of government control, tracking, or any conspiracy there? Or do you feel like we're going through a pandemic and that's what you need during a pandemic? You need a vaccine because that's just every 100 years we kind of go through this, whether it's a population control. Do you feel like it's anything based outside of the government, maybe an alien thing with population control? Or is there something to this? Or am I reading too much into just pandemic, vaccine, get better? Or are we going to get maybe a Fauci alien representative guy we're going to get the alien Fauci who comes and tells us that it's about something else? Or is it just something that happens every 100 years? Do you think there's any basis to any conspiracy there?
That's a really far-reaching question. You say 3 or 4 things that I go, yes, and then you drop one in there that's a bit, I don't know about that. So let me I was talking to my friend who's a very well-recognized naturopathic doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean like, he's doing herbs. He's doing high-level stem cell therapy replacement. He's at the forefront of, he was a primary researcher in the 90s on naturopathic medicine and HIV and stuff like that. He's just really great.
Okay.
And he made this comment that I thought was fantastic the other day. I was like, oh, Omicron's making it really difficult. I'm still teaching remotely. I wanted to travel this year. I don't know if it's going to happen. I was like, I hope it just goes away soon. And he's like, well, it won't, because when people make money off things, there's another version coming out.
Right. That's what I'm scared of.
Well, so it's kind of like in my classes on colonialism at the university. And I have to tell my students, it's really easy to think there's this room of old white guys wearing suits and smoking cigars, plotting for something like colonialism or the overtake of the world. You don't actually need that. What
Right.
you need are a lot of other things to happen you might want to say tandem with each other. The development of big seafaring boats, the invention of the Winchester rifle, diseases being spread across, and the inventing of the printing press. That's colonialism in the 16th century, but it didn't need some person planning it. So like that, I think we're dealing with a bit of what Naomi Klein calls crisis capitalism. I think people are making money off of the very real virus.
Wow.
And I think that whenever you have people making money off things, you're going to have their mediated form of doing so is with the government. So I think I'm triple vaxxed. I don't think we're being tracked. I'm very wary of critiques of expert knowledge right now.
Uh-huh.
And I'm a person who gives a lot of respect to people's wide varieties of educational experiences, which may be in or out of higher education institutions. So it's not that I think anyone with a PhD is great or anyone with a bachelor's degree is great and other people are dumb. Just the opposite. I'm not saying that.
Uh-huh.
I'm saying that I trust right now, in my personal perspective, I'm also the director of the Archive of Healing at UCLA. So I'm in conversation a bit with some of the infectious disease experts who are putting the communication out to the universities.
Okay.
And I would say that I see a lot of care and a lot of attempting to do very good inside an environment that is rife with capitalist decisions and nationalist decisions. We have to remember, anytime you go into the realm of government conspiracy, do you really think they're that smart? I mean, besides like fucking up Latin American governments and, the Chicago School of Economics and stuff like that, that was really plotting, to go into these countries, and Iraq is another example. Do you think they're able? I mean, look at some of the stuff in our last 3 administrations where you find out later, like, really? They thought that was going to work?
Yeah.
What is this, like 7 guys who planned this on a boat off of Florida with their underage partners? Like, there's almost like, really, who came up with that? How stoned were they? Like, I don't know. I just don't think I don't think we're talking about a very, very brilliant, well-organized. I think what we're talking about is an incredibly bureaucratic and almost to its own fault, so government. And I would say that about the pandemic, but I would also say that about UFOs in general. Okay.
Well, I know in the future we're going to have a lot more shows regarding space and dimension and time travel. And we're going to beg you back for that. I hope that's okay that we beg you back for another season.
I love those conversations.
And really, ghosts.
Oh, God, we got to do one. I hope this is a multi-series one. Let's just do aliens. And then next year you do psychics, and then next year you do ghosts.
Okay, as long as you're on for every season.
I don't think I've ever heard your ghost stories, and I'm sure you have some great ones.
I have some great ones. Oh, Lord, yeah. I have some really good ones. But yeah.
Off air or on air, with drinks or without, we got to cover that at some point.
Done.
All right, man.
All right, man. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. All right, I'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye.
Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. And all of our social media accounts are on Linktree. If there's anyone you'd like us to book or any questions you'd like answered, go to our website at conspiraciesinc.podcast.com.